All right, welcoming in our next panel. Are you curious about future-proofing governance and DAOs? Well, this panel is for you. We have Sky from DXdao, Dennison from Tally, Shannon from LivePeer, and Peyton from MakerDAO, moderated by Andrew from CoinDesk.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming through. Yeah, as the announcer said, we're going to be talking about future-proofing DAOs today. Have an excellent panel for this particular topic. Representatives from MakerDAO, Tally, DXdao, and the current Chief Decentralized Growth Officer, perhaps the first time that title has ever been deployed, over at LivePeer. So welcome, everyone. Let's get right into it. I think we're going to just start off by talking about some of the problems facing current DAOs, and then we'll get into talking about our panelists' respective projects. So starting off, I think a big problem we're beginning to face is that the current state of DAO tooling and sophistication has been wildly outstripped by the amount of power these organizations have and the amount of money they control. Back envelope math between DeFi TVL, treasuries, and market caps of governance tokens gets you within striking distance of $500 billion. Nonetheless, governance systems are relatively rudimentary, extremely simple. Ostensibly, this adds to their security, but we're beginning to see some cracks in as bad actors realize that DAOs can, in fact, be targets for attacks. What is the current state of DAO tooling in your guys' mind, and is it sufficient for where the ecosystem currently is? Sky, let's start with you.
Thanks. Hello. Oh, hi. DAOs are all about decentralization, and basically that's what gives them their strength. And I would say the most vulnerable pieces in the system for a DAO are the centralized points of failure. And in our current system, you can try very, very hard to maintain like decentralization throughout your entire flow, but often, you have to rely in this current world on centralized systems, maybe for your social media like Twitter, forums even, Discords, chat communication channels. And so at DXdao, we spent a lot of time trying to push and think about the tools that DAOs actually need, and we invest in projects that are building those. And I'm calling them DDApps, which is DAO dApps. And basically, if we have a tool that can be a DApp or a decentralized product, and you can log in with your wallet, what DAOs really need is the ability for the DAO to own that account. And if the DAO can own that account and control the actual permissions of the accounts that they've delegated to their contributors and members, that solves the problem. But most of these dApps that we're using in this space, if they're either Web 2 or they can't be actually owned by the DAO. And so we want teams and people that are building those to come reach out, and we can give you money. And most DAOs will give you money because we all need this if we want to actually operate in a decentralized manner.
Yeah, moving on, Scott.
Hello. Hey. Hey. Yeah. I mean, I think to step back, like, what do DAOs do? DAOs govern decisions over shared resources. So I think there's both on and off-chain governance that happens. So I kind of think of tooling around those two separate things. I think we're in very early days of both on and off-chain tooling for DAOs. On the off-chain side, there's everything from the communication layer, how we use Discord, how we use any kind of communication platform to share knowledge, develop ideas. And then, of course, on the on-chain side, there's actual token governance standards, and I think the tools around just the actual token execution of how decisions are made, we're still in fairly primitive days for that. I think that's probably something we'll get into discussing on this panel, but how we evolve towards new token governance standards beyond just liquid token governance, I think that's an important tooling question as well.
Hi. So we think about this question a lot at Tally. And one of the things we found is that the FOMO always outstrips the tooling. And I think that we've entered this kind of interesting phase where when we build better tooling, the FOMO gets bigger and outstrips the tooling even more. So something that we've started to realize and think about is how education is a really important component here. We're primarily a company based of engineers, so we have a habit of thinking the answer to most things are engineering solutions. We try to engineer our way out of everything. But what we found is that really people need to be educated a bit more on what DAOs are, what they do, what the norms are, before we even sort of experiment with other kind of things, although I'm happy more, I'm the first person who loves to experiment. People need to sort of like understand what DAOs really mean. If you look at the sort of Wonderline Finance thing where Daniele put this tweet out and he said, enough, the DAO is going to be managed by me now. And people started saying, calling it like the Daniele autocratic organization. You know, that's a real thing, right? People have to understand what is a DAO, right? Like, it's not just the FOMO of like, I threw my money in, number go up, we're all in this together, awesome. It's about the responsibilities of participating, right? The responsibilities of the success falling on your shoulders as well. So we really think there's a big educational component here that needs to be done to sort of manage folks' expectations, but also address their responsibilities in DAOs as well, because some of the latest things that you've seen happen really aren't engineering things that you can engineer your way out of, but you need to sort of like educate your way out of.
Yeah, very thoughtful. Thank you. Hi, Peyton from MakerDAO here. So I think the tooling actually is coming along really fast, and that's one of the neat thing about open source structure, right, is that new ideas tend to proliferate very quickly once they come to market. However, the problem I see with it is that we're kind of in this situation where we're laying down the train tracks while the train is chugging along. And anytime you implement a new tool, a new system, a new voting mechanism, you have to really understand the benefits and drawbacks before you implement it, or you can run into a serious danger situation. So when we look at like nation states as like a great example of people who have been doing governance for a really long time, we see that their bureaucracy, the people that actually maintain their tools and their systems, is several times larger than the people actually making the governance decisions. We're not quite there in DeFi, so I think it's actually more of a problem of getting people who are more interested in governance and can experiment with these tools, analyze them, research them, and really present plainly to communities like, hey, all right, here's a really great thing about this, and here's what you need to look out for if you are going to go forward with it.
Yeah, you guys seem a little bit more optimistic than I am about this stuff, so let's stick on why DAOs are bad for a little bit more. Just in the past 2 months, we've seen what I think some people would characterize as successful governance attacks on some of the most high-profile DAOs. Justin Sun successfully took out a flash loan and passed a Aave governance proposal to have a deployment of Aave onto Tron, and attempted to do similar shenanigans on Compound and MakerDAO, having a stablecoin he's associated with added as collateral. It seems to me that people who are powerful or clever enough, and there was, last week there was a DAO where a single member transferred the control of the token contract to himself, infinite minted the contract, and destroyed the project. DAOs are beginning to look like attack vectors. And what are the tools, you know, how quickly do we need to be laying down the train tracks in order to avert what's increasingly looking like looming disaster? Let's start with you there, Peyton.
Sure, absolutely. Security is always going to be your number one concern, right? A really big problem is the ability to borrow these governance tokens at such a large rate, because basically a core tenet of a lot of governance systems is that people who hold the token are incentivized, right, by the performance of the protocol. Well, if you're short a token, you're inverse incentivized. So you see these governance attacks potentially being quite profitable. So I think really what it kind of comes down to is designing systems and understanding when you might be at risk in those systems. For instance, if you look at our Maker voting portal, our dashboard where we handle our votes, we like to have a little box that says like, all right, here's how much available Maker there is at other lending platforms. Here's how much Maker is staked in the governance contract. Just so it's very clear to people that like, hey, if these numbers start switching one way or the other, we might be in danger, and we kind of need to mobilize and take action. So transparency is your best friend in DAOs, right? The greater chance that everyone can see and understand a situation means that when something starts going wrong, you can have a much faster response to it. Because there will be attacks. There's just too much money at stake for people not to try.
Sorry, please.
To sort of like follow on that, we can't expect the technology itself to save us, right? Like, again, I'm thinking about like an educational component. People also have to be paying attention, right? DAOs cannot simply exist as smart contracts and expect that, you know, just because it's Christmas Eve, you don't have to be like watching the shop, right? Like, it's not enough to think that the systems alone are going to be enough, because the systems, the way they work, are pretty clearly spelled out, and people have a lot of time to sort of think about the organization of these systems and kind of find a way around it. I think we also have to be very careful in what we characterize as governance attacks, right? There is a fine line between people we don't like getting ideas through and people actually attacking, right? And that is something we have to keep in mind. Like, Justin Sun, of course, is like the boogeyman, and we don't like him, is the sort of idea that the Ethereum community pushes. But I think that's a dangerous idea to push, right? He is another contributor in the ecosystem of Web3, whether or not we like it. And the systems that he were interacting with were permissible for him to do what he tried to do, right? There isn't, in my mind, an enormous difference between borrowing tokens to get a proposal through and whining and dining delegates to get them to agree in a back room that your idea is something that they want to support, right? So I think we have to be careful on that, and we do have to double down on education and vigilance, which is saying, hey, if you're part of this DAO, people have a responsibility to watch the shop, and probably DAOs should step up and pay people to make sure that they are doing that on a regular basis.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, it's important to just be clear on what we mean by the risk. And I think, you know, Sybil attacks are kind of like the number one problem that gets identified when we think about liquid token governance. And that's when you have one anonymous actor creating multiple accounts that effectively makes them the whale. I think in the case of Aave, we actually knew who the attacker was. So, you know, there's even some transparency around that. So I think, you know, there are different kinds of problems we're talking about. I do also want to just call out that the DAO, I think you've set up the question around the DeFi DAO landscape, and I represent LivePeer, which is actually not a DeFi project. We are a proof-of-stake protocol that's using blockchain technology to actually build core internet infrastructure. We're doing decentralized video transcoding. So people show up for a different reason, fundamentally, when they run a node with LivePeer. So I think that the threats, you know, are still real, but they're a little different than in a DeFi protocol when you have purely financially incentivized actors.
I think you can actually design a system that is not susceptible to those things. The two examples that you gave, the first is it can be attacked with a lot of money. So if you have a lot of money, you can attack it. So you can solve that problem. And then second is it's not decentralized. So if something's not decentralized and someone has like a key to access something and they can take over and then mint everything, that's also a problem. So if you design a system that can't be attacked with money, and you design a system that's actually distributed and decentralized, and you can basically design a system that can't be attacked, I think.
Yeah, these are great points. Dennison, I want to start with you on this one because you touched on this a little bit. One of the ways you can defend against these types of attacks that we've seen, or not attacks, you made a good point there, is through greater participation. Some of the most important votes in these protocols get 24 addresses involved at most, and only a fraction of a governance token's circulating supply. You know, we were just dragging Danielle, but the vote not to unwind Wonderland's treasury is by far the most popular DAO vote ever. It had over 20,000 participants, and it's kind of wild that the most popular ever is only 20,000 participants. So what can we do to galvanize more participation? What kinds of crypto-economic networks could we create around incentivizing participation, or is it really, you know, a public good? People just need to get off their ass. They shouldn't be paid.
Yeah, so those are some great questions. Something I like to think about is, you know, when we talk about 20,000 people showed up, right? A lot of people recently showed up in the ENS sort of brouhaha that was happening in their community. People show up when they care, right? When it affects them, when they have an opinion, they show up when they care. A lot of votes that happen in DeFi protocols are extremely abstract technical things. So people say, oh, only 20 people showed up, but I would be really impressed if 20,000 people showed up to like readjust the multi-collateralization ratio across like, DeFi lending pools at like, some sort of inverse ratio to something or other, right? That would be a different world that we would be living in. So I think it depends on what people are voting on. And certainly I think you probably can design systems that are more responsible of saying, hey, if only 3 people show up to this, maybe the vote should be going longer, or maybe like more people should have to like go through this process. Maybe you can design systems to give the community the ability to look over these decisions a little bit better. But again, if you don't understand how it works, you don't understand how it works. Like with Wonderland, I think a lot of people were just promised number go up, and they weren't sure if number would go down, and so they got in there and it's just like, oh no, save us, let's vote. But did they participate before then, right? Like when number went up, did they check in or care? Did they just say, number goes up, everything's fine, I don't have to care, right? Additionally, we need better tools, right? We need better tools to understand what's happening. We probably need more primitives that become universal, that they can understand, right? So I think it's a combination of things, but one thing that I do want to point out is a lot of these systems are very new, right? So when we talk about decentralization, there's a little bit of a mismatch of thinking, okay, 3 women get together and they decide that they're going to build some sort of new lending protocol. It's very complicated, and they launch it. 4 weeks later, it's a little unreasonable to expect that everyone around the world is going to participate in how it runs, right? When most of the knowledge of the project exists within these 3 or 4 women's heads, right? So when we talk about decentralization, we should add a time scale to it, right? If Compound is not decentralized by the year 2340, right? Like, yeah, it's a failure, right? That's not decentralized. But if it's not decentralized a couple years later, right? Like, I have a small child. 5 years into having a small child, you still have a small child, right? Like, it's not done yet. So sometimes we have to like take a step back and think, at what point are we judging the decentralization of these organizations? Because if they're complicated, they're going to be hard to build.
Yeah, I also think that there's a misconception that unless everyone votes on everything, it's not a DAO. DeFi doesn't have delegated governance. We actually have, as a proof of stake protocol, a delegated proof of stake where token holders delegate their tokens to node operators who have, those governance rights. In our case, delegators can, if they wish, choose to vote against their node operators. But again, the types of decisions we're making based on the protocol and infrastructure network that they are highly technical. But as a node operator, you're highly incentivized to want to pay attention to the changes that are being proposed, to make changes, and to vote on those. And again, I think it's like not everything has to proceed to an on-chain vote as well. I mentioned the difference between on and off-chain governance. Like, surely there are things that we should just be able to, collectively decide on, and those who want to engage in that decision-making to deliberate openly and be really transparent so that people can see ultimately what decisions were made. I think that, as a member of a community, what you care about most is being informed about the decisions that are happening.
For me, so whether you're a DAO that already exists or a project that wants to decentralize and become a DAO or a small DAO that's just starting, I think the most important part is getting governance of your ecosystem in the hands of people that will be good governors. And that's not an easy thing to do, but one way to do it, one way not to do it is just let people who have a lot of money buy governance power in your system. One way to do it, which is not perfect, is to give governance power only to people that contribute value to your ecosystem. So starting that from scratch is very hard. There are people walking around ETH Denver this week that are actually handing out NFT governance power to a DAO that's about to start. And that is a very unique way to distribute and launch a DAO, but it's coming from a couple people's minds, right? Another way is to only give governance power to people that actively contribute and do a proposal to your DAO and add value to your community. And that can be dev work, that can be liquidity, that can be marketing, that can be community support. And if you give those people governance power, they're clearly interested because they've already been contributing before they got the governance power. And even if you have other people that have governance power, if they stop contributing or they were initially had governance power and you are basically giving away new governance power, it creates inflation and it dilutes the people that are not being active, that maybe don't care anymore. And with DXdao, it's worked. There was an initial distribution, and we've had about 60% inflation, and it's worked rather well. Now, it's not as distributed as some big projects. There are not 20,000 people that have governance power in DXdao. There are about 550 wallets that hold governance power, and only 100 of those maybe have voted in the last 2 months. But you know that those 100 people that are voting earn that governance power by actually contributing value. And so we believe that that is a step in the right direction. There are, Malik DAOs also do share-based governance where you have to actually contribute value or sometimes contribute capital to get that governance power. But these DAOs are pretty open. Even if you can't buy a liquid token to get governance power, if you contribute value to a community, they will probably award you governance power, no matter what community that is. So it's something that a lot of people are interested in. The tooling's not great right now. We have some tools that we use, but these are going to get better and better. And a lot of people like this idea, like even Vitalik would support this kind of thing, I think.
Yeah, Peyton, I want to hear from you on this because you're our resident paid protocol politician. You're a professional governance participant. Is that a viable model? Is that going to be, do we just pay the smartest guys to run governance for us?
Yeah, that's certainly an option, right? There's going to be benefits and trade-offs to everything. We talk a lot about cost, right? And we tend to go directly to economic cost of like, okay, well, layer 1 is expensive, so what if we move things to layer 2? And that's a good thing to do. That's something we're working on at MakerDAO. However, a much harder problem to address is how do we address the opportunity costs of actually being an informed voter? Right, if you have 10 proposals going up this week and it takes you 40 hours to actually make an informed decision on them, you're only going to have your insiders voting on it, whether you like it or not, or at least voting as a fully informed voter, someone who's kind of taking the interests of the DAO fully in heart. So at MakerDAO, one thing we've kind of come out with is delegation. We're about 6 months in. I don't know, time's a little weird. Someone can dunk me on Twitter if I'm significantly off there, but we basically came up with a way where we could, as permissionlessly as possible, allow delegation to take place while still putting on some kind of off-chain restraints that make the larger delegates recognizable, have them communicate their reasoning to the community. That way, even if you're not able to take part in a vote or you're not able to pay attention to what your delegate did last week, you can catch it up really quickly in a post. That way, you can at least evaluate how people are making informed decisions and kind of use that liquid democracy aspect to reallocate your token weight if for any reason you feel that someone is not doing their job of actually evaluating these things.
Got it. Yeah. Well, we're supposed to be talking about future-proofing DAOs, so I'd like to get into architectural trade-offs that you guys have to make. I think everybody's familiar with the blockchain trilemma. You have the choices between decentralization, computational speed, and security. I think DAOs face similar problems. The Danielle Autocratic Organization, look, a multi-sig of like 2 guys, they can sling some funds around and they can do more complex things with their treasury because of the centralization. So when you're thinking about potentially creating a system that still needs to exist hundreds of years from now and facilitate, potential entry from institutional players, from nation states perhaps, what are some of the trade-offs you make in building these governance systems, and what should people, which axes should they be leaning towards when they have to make those decisions in order to make sure they build something that is durable and can last? Sky, let's start with you.
Yes, from my perspective, we already have centralized systems, whether we're talking about the NFT space or Web 2 or finance. We already have centralized systems, so we can already use those. And so if you're making a DAO and it's sacrificing decentralization in order to achieve the other things, to me that's not that interesting. So the core principles, which a lot of them come from the Ethereum space, like maximum decentralization and moving that direction is, for me, one of the most important things, because that's what allows censorship resistance. If we have a DeFi project that has the front end owned by the actual company in New York City, it is censored and it can be shut down, and that's not that interesting. If you have a DeFi protocol where the front end is actually owned by a DAO, actually owned by a decentralized entity, and even if they could come after a couple people, no government in the world can actually go after the entire DAO and shut down this front end. And so things that as an example is something that DXdao it probably leads in the space, like decentralization first, and then we move a little slow because of that, so we're less scalable than someone who is a smaller team. And I forget what the third part is, but we probably, decentralization is the most important. But other DAOs don't have to do that, and we'll see. It only matters when it matters, and it hasn't mattered right so far, but I think it will at some point.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the premise that decentralization is what's needed to future-proof governance and to make projects sustainable, and then thinking about how you achieve that and the threats to it, it is about identification and having as much confidence that you do have a large number of truly distinctly identified nodes or participants in your network. And I mean, that's what we talk about when we say governance risk, is when you have one actor that is maliciously pretending to be a bunch of decentralized nodes in your network. So I think the question of identification is a really huge one, and we're just really starting, I think, as a space to tackle identity systems in governance.
I'm a pretty practical person, and I think we're going to get there. Something I like to think about is how the pyramids were built to last for all time, and they're still here, but the people who built them are not. And again, my experience is formed a little bit for being in an organization that is very engineering heavy, so we tend to think that engineering is the solution for things, where maybe it's not, right? Like, if the people, you could have a smart contract that is fundamentally completely decentralized or impervious to attack, but if the people leave, it's still a failure, right? And I think it's difficult to say that we want to design something that can last forever if we don't know what forever actually looks like, right? Are we going to be doing DeFi, 150,000 years from now, right? Maybe, maybe not. And while that might seem like, kind of a silly analogy, it's like, okay, is it 75,000 years or, 22,000 years or 3 years, right? Like, what is the amount of time necessary to say that something has succeeded? And in my mind currently is if people still show up, if people still care, then it's still succeeding, right? And some of these governance attacks are fatal for the organizations that have been building them, and that is a shame. But the people are not gone, and they are able to rebuild it and rebuild it better. So I think there's this kind of idea of like, when you break bones and they heal back, they'll heal back a little bit stronger. I look forward to the next couple years of governance attacks to actually teach us where the edges are, what really doesn't work. And I think from that learning, we'll probably be able to build much better systems.
Definitely, that's very inspiring. I guess the three things I think about most are security, incentivization, and transparency. Because I think if you can kind of work along those axes, you can really build towards a resilient system. The issue is, like, oftentimes you can have a really secure system without an incentive structure, but then you introduce an incentive structure, and suddenly you go from a situation where you have a few malicious actors, right, that might be motivated to take you down, to an army of rational actors that can profit by taking you down. And that's a much higher security barrier. But the nice kind of bit of transparency that adds in there is, like, it's actually okay to fail. Like, it's obviously there's a lot of money at stake. You need to protect people, and you should fail softly. But the nice thing about open source, about being completely transparent with your systems, is if something breaks, you can always start again. You can always go back and refork and take your lessons learned and apply them in a better manner. So I think as long as you're thinking along those three axes, like, you can really build something that'll stand the test of time.
Awesome. I think we have about 2 minutes left, so very briefly, can you guys talk about what new things are happening with DAOs at your respective organizations, and what are the new progress that your organizations are making on this front?
We haven't had a chance to go first.
Oh, hey. Yeah, LivePeer just migrated to Arbitrum Layer 2. We went through our governance process for that. We do have liquid token governance, but we are going to be exploring identity systems in our protocol as well. So I just want to emphasize we are not a DeFi project. We are building core internet infrastructure, and that's why we govern.
Yeah, so we build DAO products for ourselves in this weird little niche space, but what we at DXdao realized is it would be awesome to bring this to the real world. And so one thing we recently did, this jersey is Copenhagen Flames, which is an esports team in Copenhagen. And DXdao is the shoulder sponsor. And the reason we did this is because the founders of this team love crypto, are want to learn about DAOs, and they actually want to DAOify their community. And so we have a goal in 2022 to help their community become a DAO, to help them make decisions. Obviously, it's not going to own the financial wins of the team and stuff, but if they can DAOify their community and that works, we can do that. You can scale that across other spaces and then start doing it with towns and states and governments as well.
At Tally, we're building tools for making proposals easier. One thing that we found that it's a blocker to decentralization is the knowledge of making change resides in too few people. And you have a situation where someone wants to do something, but the person who's technically capable of doing that disagrees and just says sort of like, yeah, sure, go do it. And then the people who want to do it are like, well, we don't know how. And they're like, sucks to be you. So we're trying to make tools that make participating easier. I don't know if that one.
We're iterating on delegation that I mentioned before. One thing I'm really excited about that it's not me, it's some of our awesome guys from the Dux team, our development and user experience. They're working on getting us L2 voting this coming up in the next few months. Just continuing to chip away at the cost of governance. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thanks guys for your time. Wonderful hearing from you all.